Hey, Earthlings, welcome along to yet another vegan time tunnel. And for those of you who don't know, we're putting together an archive of significant events in the history of the vegan social movement or the animal rights movement as such. So this is the beginning of two specials. I don't normally have guests, but I do today. I've had Ronnie Lee before to talk about the ALF, but he doesn't really count, as we know. So I'm going to count Vance as my first guest, and there's a very special guest next week, which we'll talk about in a while. So as usual, then with the situation, as we know, if you're not on my YouTube channel, that's the best place to be in order to see all of the chat. Okay. And as ever, comment away, and then we'll never charge you to have your comment put on the screen. Now, we do have a presentation today, so if you see things in that you want to comment on, either make a note or just put them in the comments, and then we'll review the comments at the end. So you won't kind of we won't kind of miss them out if you like. So that's the idea. A few people in the house already, so welcome along, everyone. Now, my guest then is Vance Lehmkuhl, and I'm reading from the American Vegan Society. Vance Lehmkuhl is a longtime vegan journalist and event planner, expert in communications and the marketing of vegan initiatives. Prior to his stint at the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News, where he worked in various online capacities and wrote Philly's first vegan newspaper column, Vance worked in the communications department of the Pew Charitable Trusts and managed circulation at the Curtis Institute of Music Library. He also helmed, nice word, 2 large-scale exhibitions in the main entrance area of the Free Library of Philadelphia and wrote on a variety of topics for more than a decade at Philadelphia City Paper. Now, the reason we have him today is because he knows a heck of a lot more than me about the American vegan social movement, and he is the director of the American Vegan Center and also the corporate secretary, communications director of the American Vegan Society. So he's really well placed to give us a sense of how the North American vegan movement got going. So that's pretty good. So without further ado, welcome along to another Vegan Time Tunnel. Hey, Vance, hello. Welcome along. Let me just move you over. There we go. So when we come to do your presentation, you'll be on the top on the side. So we can start off really, Vance, but you can just tell us a little bit about how long you've been vegan, how do you get involved, what you're doing right now, and you've got the center behind you, I see. So that's all going. So what's your story?
Yeah, so I'm here at the American Vegan Center. This is an initiative that the American Vegan Society started at the end of 2021 here in Old City, Philadelphia. I was one of the instigators to getting this going, now helping to run that. But I have been working for the American Vegan Society since 2019 and informally worked with them many times before that, as I feel indebted to the work that they've done since I originally went vegan as a result of attending a conference that the North American Vegetarian Society put on, which I went to as a vegetarian, called Vegetarian Summerfest. Had it been called Vegan Summerfest, I probably wouldn't have gone, because at the time I knew that vegans were extreme and humorless and had no sense of proportion and all this stuff. So I met a bunch of vegans, ate a bunch of vegan food, and got introduced to a lot of facts that I didn't know, and I decided to go vegan. Even at that point, I did not realize that the North American Vegetarian Society was originally created by Dinshah and Freya Dinshah of the American Vegan Society in order to be able to host the 1975 World Vegetarian Congress. So it was basically because of them, and like so many other people, because of their work, I wound up going vegan. It's been about 23 years now. Then after going vegan, I started writing for the Daily News, writing on vegan topics, and eventually got a column there, V for Veg, which I did for 5.5 years. And yeah, have been just constantly looking for different ways to promote the vegan idea, often using the promotion of vegan food as a vehicle to get that conversation started. But as you know, a lot of people may think of vegan as just having to do with food, but I'm constantly trying to find ways to push the conversation just beyond strictly talking about food concerns into the ethics behind it. And so, yeah, one of the things that came together for the American Vegan Center was that AVS, which is headquartered over in South Jersey, in a small town out of the way, has done some things in Philadelphia, but didn't have really a big public presence in Philadelphia. So that is one of the points, is just basically getting them in people's faces to let people know there is an American Vegan Society that has been doing all this great work all this time. And that was great for them. Also, I had been doing a lot of research into Philadelphia's vegetarian and vegan history, and started doing veg history walking tours. And so what I'm going to be talking about derives a lot from that. Now, my walking tour really focuses strictly on Philadelphia. It's about how the U.S. vegetarian movement started in Philadelphia, and how much of that was actually driven by people that we might now call vegans, and how that then kind of led to the 20th century growth of the U.S. vegan movement, when we actually had the word vegan, thanks to the Vegan Society over on your side. But I will be trying to adapt some of this to give a little bit more of an overview of what was happening in the States.
Yeah, that's great. Well, just a couple of things before we do the presentation from what you just said. A lot of historians seem to pick out that 1975 Vegetarian Congress as being really powerful, kind of a spark, really, in terms of the vegan movement. Is that your recollection of it?
Yeah, I mean, I was not paying attention at the time, but that is what, yeah, a lot of people saying what has been borne out. There were actual organizations founded by people that went there and were inspired. There were other people that started working together because of that. And it is something where they brought together a wide variety of different people from different disciplines, different ideologies, just around, again, using this concept of eating vegetarian, and what, all the tangents that you can go off of from that to really cross-pollinate a lot of different people. And a lot of people went away from that just inspired to get things done. A lot of them did get things done. So,
And the second thing was, you mentioned, veganism is much more than a diet, but there is quite a bit of tension at the moment in the British situation, where there's quite a lot of people who seem to be promoting veganism as a diet, and there's a lot of other people going, well, actually, it's much more than that. Is that the same over there on the other side of the pond?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know to what extent the term plant-based has permeated the culture over there. Over here, there's a lot of people who either, some vegans who try to strictly use the word plant-based when talking about people's eating patterns, and then reserve vegan for a motivation that comes from an ethical place. But then there's other people who say, when you talk about food, you shouldn't put the word vegan on it. You should put plant-based, because vegan will scare people. And that I'm not an adherent to that theory.
No.
You have some of the most popular vegan products, Miyoko's cheeses, and Miyoko puts unapologetically vegan right on the label. She actually uses that word. So, and they sell like cheesecakes, I guess,
Like
not hot.
cheesecakes, yeah.
Yeah.
On the grounds that that's what they are. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's a real parallel there over here, especially this kind of, these kind of tensions about, is veganism a scare word? There are still some people who suggest that when it's not really, and it was the grassroots and the stores that,
Yeah,
that
I'll just say that, I mean, obviously, the word has been around since 1944. It's gone through an evolution where it was just something that most people didn't hear. When I wrote my first piece for the Daily News, I had to have a sidebar explaining, here's what the word vegan refers to.
yes.
But now it's gone to the place where most people have heard it, and it's going to continue to grow in people's understanding. It's still not, I mean, the average person in America, at least, probably still hears the word vegan and says, oh, that's those people that they don't want, animals involved, or they don't want to eat animals, or whatever. They may have a hazy concept, but at least they have some concept. And again, part of the work that we're trying to do at the American Vegan Center is to help to normalize veganism and get it into really the center of the mainstream conversation where it belongs, rather than being something on the margins that people feel they need to be scared of associating with. So being right here on, we're in the middle of a big tourist area. I watch people walking by every day and seeing our signage and seeing some of the stuff that we have in the windows. And even, the majority of them, I will say, don't wind up coming in, but I can see in their faces that just their worldview has adjusted a tiny bit at that point to say, oh, so there's an American Vegan Center now? This is where we've got to? Well, yeah, it is where we've got to.
And they can even pronounce the word now. So, Vance, I invite you then to begin your presentation. And again, for the people in the chat, if you think of a question, throw it up there or leave it to the end. We will come back. So if it goes off the screen, we'll come back to it. So we won't miss it. So do you want me to put the yeah, okay. So
okay, there we go. Great.
So I'm going to mute myself and leave you alone for a while.
All right, great. Okay, so I'm going to be stepping through some of this history using some graphics that I've created. The caricatures are mine. The backgrounds on all of them are just things that I grabbed and posterized. But at any rate, the kind of the sweep of this history, as I was saying when Roger and I were prepping this, the British history has a lot of more coherent kind of linearity to it. It kind of goes from this to this to this, whereas American history is a little more scattershot and has some outliers and some things that created an influence, but they didn't necessarily flower until much later. But I think that you'll see as it comes together that it is in its own way a coherent story. So we're going to start with one of the outliers, which is Conrad Bisel in the Ephrata cloister. Conrad Bisel came to Pennsylvania as a German immigrant and started this vegetarian cloister out in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I could say a bunch about it, but the key thing here that's interesting to me is that by 1745, the group had a choir, and Conrad Bisel became the director of the choir and wrote down rules for his singers. And one of the key rules was that they could not eat any animal products. He went through all of the animal products, giving these reasons why he didn't want his singers eating eggs or milk. Or I mean, milk. The thing with milk, if you're going to go sing, you don't drink a glass of milk right before you're going to sing. But meat, eggs, cheese, honey. He even prescribed honey. And so you may think, well, he was just a crackpot, but he may have been. But he introduces, interestingly, this list of foods by saying, and now we come to the foods which we, with great injustice, take from the animals. So I think that he may very well have been a vegan himself. Obviously, he didn't have the word. It's not easy to pin down. But that group, the choir, for the time that he ran it, was a group of North Americans who were intentionally vegan. I don't know. It's certainly the first such situation in North America that I know of. Again, they were vegan from diet. The singers may not have bought into the ethics that Conrad Bisel seemed to be bringing, but there were other clues. This is a kind of off-kilter photograph of a large painting, which is the first thing you see as you walk into the visitor center at Ephrata, which is depicting the elders building the town, plowing the land to build the original town of Ephrata, and hitching themselves to the plow because they would not use animals to work the land. It's unclear whether this is actually true, but this was the lore of Ephrata, that they said that that was the case way back when this painting obviously was not painted at that time, but it is another clue. But either way, Ephrata did not have a huge impact on the U.S. movement. It is, as I say, kind of an outlier, but it's very interesting that they had a vegan group at that point. Concurrently, over in Philadelphia, you had Benjamin Lay, who's really a fascinating person. He was the first abolitionist activist in North America. He was a little person, what people at the time called a dwarf. He was also what people at the time called a hunchback. He was also what people at the time called a royal pain in the ass. And that's because he was very stubborn. And when it came to abolition of slavery, he just was relentless. And he developed these different stunts. I can't go into all of his stunts, but the long and the short of it is that his abolitionist crusade was largely dismissed by able-bodied people who just said, well, he's this funny little guy with his crazy obsessions, and they felt like they didn't have to pay much attention to it. But for Benjamin Lay, his abolitionism and his kind of quasi-veganism were part of one concept. He really took seriously the concept of God's mercy being extended to all creatures. And he wrote a book against slavery, in which there's several passages where he either praises vegans or draws a direct equivalency between the dominations of animals and the domination of Black people by white people. And so he did not eat meat. He may have drunk milk. His biographer, Marcus Rediker, originally said that he did, but in his latest book claims that he's not sure now. But at any rate, Benjamin Lay would not wear wool. He would not wear leather. He would not wear dyed clothing because you had two dyes, blue and red. Blue was from indigo, which was a slave product, and Benjamin Lay pioneered the concept of boycotting slave products, pioneered basically the concept of boycotting. This is 150 years before you had the word boycott. And red dye came from crushing insects. And he was like, I don't need that stuff. I don't need fancy clothes, which is true. He didn't. He lived in a cave and he grew his own food. He grew flax and made his own clothes out of flax. He also would not travel by horse and carriage. He said, I can walk. Why should the horses work for me? So he really had a kind of visionary attitude about that. And Benjamin Lay, had a big impact on a man named Anthony Benezet. So Benezet was a younger generation Quaker. Benezet, John Woolman, Joshua Evans, these were Quakers who saw some of Benjamin Lay's activism and got interested in the concept of abolition. And they all also went vegetarian to one degree or another, and also mimicked his refusal to wear wool or leather or travel by horse and carriage. And Benezet was probably the most intense of the three. Once he went vegetarian, he stuck to it, where the other two kind of treated it a little more cavalierly. But Benezet, famous quote, when his brother invited him, or he stopped by his brother's house and they were eating dinner, they were eating poultry, probably turkey or chicken at the time, and his brother's wife said, "Come on, sit down and join us." And Benazet said, "Would you have me eat my neighbors?" So he, he also had a garden. He loved gardening, where he grew most of his own food again. And like many people, there were rats that would come into the garden. It's in the middle of the city, and Benazet was famous for feeding the rats. And people would say, "You're just going to have more rats if you feed the rats." And he's like, "No, when I feed them, they leave my vegetables alone." And so he claimed that worked for him. So anyway, I mean, I would love to just spend the whole time on Benazet. He's an amazing person. He spread the concept of abolitionism worldwide. He was a major influence on Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson, and even William Wilberforce, who didn't get into the whole thing until after Benazet died. When the three of them were agitating or speaking in front of Parliament about getting England out of the slave trade, they were often reading stuff that Benazet had sent them, or reading directly from the works of Benazet himself. So again, these are just some interesting vegetarians leaning toward vegan in the 18th century, but their activism was not about, it was not vegan-based or vegetarian-based activism. They were concentrating mostly on something else. But in 1817, you did finally get the start of a vegetarian movement when the Bible Christians arrived from England. As I'm sure you're aware, Roger, and maybe many of your viewers are aware, the Bible Christians were a major force in England for getting vegetarianism going. In 1817, they sent 40 people over to the US to spread the good news that you could live without eating animals. That group wound up splitting as half of the people kind of lapsed and went off somewhere else. The ones in Philadelphia struggled for a while to get traction. And it was basically thanks to Susanna Metcafe opening a school up on just north of Girard Street, just north of Philadelphia. William Metcafe was a school teacher himself, but his school was down where we are now in Old City, what's now called Old City. And there was a yellow fever epidemic that was killing all of his students. So, his school was failing, and the whole, the Bible Christians the pastor did not take money from the congregation. They had to have their own profession. So at that point, the Bible Christians in America would likely have died out as an organization, except that Susanna started this school north of the city, where the yellow fever was not happening so much, and she became successful enough that she essentially hired William Metcafe to work at her school, which, of course, being the man of the house, he then took over the school and continued. And they then started picking up converts and actually growing. And an interesting thing about the Bible Christians, they also did not consume alcohol. I will mention that Anthony Benazet also did not drink alcohol and wrote one of the first anti-alcohol books in North America, which Sylvester Graham may have read. Sylvester Graham came to Philadelphia and helped spread the Bible Christians message nationally. He had a big influence on John Harvey Kellogg later in the century, and I'm not going into a lot of detail on that because I'm trying to concentrate more on what I call the vegan idea, whereas there's already kind of this cliche that a lot of people think that American vegetarianism and veganism was really about health, and there was certainly a lot of that going on in those particular aspects of this. But let's just say that Grahamism became a big thing, even though it was not, it didn't have necessarily the same ethical basis, but it was also tied in with abolitionism. It had that kind of ethical connection. There's Sylvester Graham. Sorry, I should have gotten him on there when I was talking about him, but I have depicted him here eating his signature food, Graham bread, which was a very dense and chewy kind of bread. It was whole wheat bread, which at the time was just crazy, because everybody was like, why would you eat that when you can eat white bread? So he did have a good sense on that. But I want to just mention the abolitionists in the 19th century. By this point, the Quakers had become the main drivers of U.S. abolitionism, and Grahamism, the Graham diet, really caught on with a lot of the abolitionists. And two key abolitionists were Angelina Grimke and Theodore Weld, depicted here. They were both Grahamites, and they met and fell in love and were married in Philadelphia. And behind them is a classic picture of the burning of Pennsylvania Hall, which is a fascinating story that we do not have time for right now. But just suffice to say that that was a situation where it was their vegetarianism that provided at least some connection that may have led to the flowering of that romance. And I should also mention Angelina had a sister, Sarah Grimke, and Angelina and Sarah became well-known speakers, talking about slavery and also talking about women's rights. They were really getting that out there early in the 19th century. We're going to move on to Bronson Alcott, who was also in Philadelphia at the same time. He was a teacher in the mold of Anthony Benezet, who was, I keep coming back to him, but he was also a teacher. Benezet was really revolutionary in rejecting the concept of a disciplinarian teacher and actually sitting down with the kids and getting to know them. Bronson Alcott was famous for that also. I got a job at Germantown Academy and eventually moved into Philadelphia, where he spent weeks immersed in books at the Loganian Library, where he could finally read all this vegetarian and vegan philosophy. Well, he at the time was just interested in reading philosophy, but he found out that a lot of the early philosophers, as I'm sure you're aware, were vegetarian. I mean, not just Pythagoras, but people like Empedocles, Diogenes, Plutarch, Seneca, Heraclitus, Plotinus, Ovid, Porphyry. So many of those Bronson read at that point, just before leaving Philadelphia to go back to Boston and start another school. And when he started that school, he was at that point vegetarian, trending vegan. And what happened next is a fellow named Greaves over in England, just outside of London, who was a vegan already in the 1830s, heard about Bronson Alcott and was so inspired by him that he went ahead with this idea that he had for a planned vegan community with a school at its hub, and he called it Alcott House after Bronson Alcott. And Alcott House is where we get the word vegetarian. They coined the term vegetarian. Bronson Alcott came to visit and was so inspired that he went back to the U.S. and started a vegan commune. This was called Fruitlands. It was in Massachusetts. They had very high-minded ideals. They were going to eat entirely vegan, wear no wool, no leather, no cotton, because you basically could not get cotton that didn't come from slavery. So they were, again, picking up on some of the ideas that Benjamin Lay had gotten started. Also, just trying to live off the grid and being self-sufficient, as Benjamin Lay had. They were trying to do that. They also hitched themselves to the plow, so to speak. They wouldn't use work animals to plow the fields. They wouldn't use manure to fertilize the fields. So they were really some of the first practitioners in North America of what we now call veganic agriculture. They had a lot of flaws, let's say, personality flaws, and they really bit off more than they could chew. And long story short, Fruitlands only lasted about 6 or 7 months before it failed in the middle of the winter, where they didn't have as much food because they'd done a terrible job managing the harvest, and they just had linen. They kept putting on more and more linen, and they kept arguing about what the whole point of what they were doing was, and eventually that failed. But it did have those repercussions. Meanwhile, we back in Philadelphia, William Metcalfe and the Bible Christians heard about something that had happened in 1847 with the Bible Christians, and the staff of Alcott House who had gotten together to create the Vegetarian Society. William Metcalfe said we should have an American Vegetarian Society. So he got Sylvester Graham on board, and they elected as the president of the American Vegetarian Society William Alcott, who was Bronson Alcott's cousin, and also, I assert, was a dietary vegan. He was not a vegan in the sense that Bronson Alcott was. He wasn't a philosopher, he was a doctor. So for him, it was probably more from a health nutrition basis. But it's interesting that we have a little microcosm of the situation in the Vegetarian Society, where the Alcott House people were using the word vegetarian to mean what we mean by vegan. And the Bible Christians said, no, if we're going to have this whole thing, we have to include milk and honey because we were promised the land of milk and honey. And the Alcott House people finally said, all right, whatever. And in America, we don't have proof of these conversations, but they had a magazine, American Vegetarian and Health Journal, which William Alcott was one of the main writers for that magazine. And that magazine helped really popularize the word vegetarian across the United States through the middle of the 19th century. And there's several passages where William Alcott is writing in this very careful way, almost as though he's in a hostage video, trying to like blink a certain number of times to get across the fact that he's really vegan, even though since the Bible Christians were the ones running the magazine, he couldn't come out and say it. So that's kind of an interesting little phenomenon that was happening there. The Civil War really did a number on U.S. vegetarianism, partially because most vegetarians were abolitionists and most vegetarians were also pacifists. So when you had this war to abolish slavery, people kind of felt like they had to pick one team or another, and it dissipated a lot of that energy. Also, William Metcalfe died at age 71 during the Civil War. So after the Civil War, we see the torch getting picked up by Carolyn Earl White. She was born into an abolitionist family, long before the Civil War. But after the Civil War is really when she got going, and she started the first animal shelters in the United States. She co-founded the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. She also started the American Anti-Vivisection Society, which interestingly, Roger, since I know you, I don't know how much you talk about that on here, but you sometimes are interested in the distinction between welfarism and abolitionism. And the American Anti-Vivisection Society was actually started as the American Society to restrict vivisection, basically just to stop animal experimenters from picking up household pets that had gotten out of their yard and then taking and torturing them to death. She felt like if she could just address that was open to get regulations that would forbid that. And she actually worked with politicians in Philadelphia and Harrisburg, male politicians, of course, who kept saying they were going to bring these bills and get them passed. And at the end of each session, they kept coming back saying, sorry, Carolyn, we had to trade it away at the last minute for something else, but we'll get them next year. So finally, after a couple of years of this, she was like, forget it. It's the American Anti-Vivisection Society. And we have her depicted here next to a fountain in Washington Square that's just a few blocks away from here. This is a horse drinking fountain, which is one of the things that she got going. Most of her work, I will say, was much more from a welfarist perspective, just trying to help animals in the situation they were in. So even though she didn't want to see horses being forced to work, she wanted, if they were being forced to work, to help them out. And so she was one of the main people who got these horse drinking fountains installed around Philadelphia and in a couple of other cities also. And as a legacy, they're a great thing because they're very heavy and hard to move. And so there are a lot of them still around. They're one of the few things that we can still see. And on our tour, we actually go and see that because it is one of the few things that's still there. But also in town at the same time in Philadelphia was Henry Clubb. There's a picture of Henry Clubb getting shot in the Civil War. Whether or not this was the cause of his getting shot, he participated in the Civil War as a pacifist because he was such a firm abolitionist, and he felt he could split the difference by serving on the front lines of the war, but refusing to carry a weapon because he said, I'm not going to be able to kill a man, so I'm not going to need a weapon. So he did get shot, but he survived. He went on to Michigan, eventually came back to Philadelphia, was invited by the Bible Christians to take over as the new pastor of the Bible Christian Church in the United States. And he did that and launched a new national organization called the Vegetarian Society of America. And they also had a magazine called Food, Home, and Garden. And Clubb had originally, his first steps into the movement had been over at Alcott House, where he worked as a teenager. So he did have, as a young man, you know, in his formative years, he experienced being immersed in this vegan world. And it may be because of that that the VSA actually moves much further toward veganism than the old American Vegetarian Society had. And just want to mention one item in here, peanut butter. This is a picture that shows walnuts in a mortar and pestle, but this was used to illustrate a blog post about nut milks and nut butters because peanut butter was introduced to American grocery stores by John Harvey Kellogg, but of course he didn't invent this concept. Native Americans were actually making nut butters and nut milks before Europeans even arrived because they did not domesticate animals for food. So they were likely the ones that had come up with this. But John Harvey Kellogg gets credit for calling it peanut butter, you know, making the formulation that we now know as peanut butter and putting it on grocery shelves called that. And the magazine Food, Home, and Garden had an announcement about this being available. And they said, this is something you can use in place of butter. That's actually why John Harvey Kellogg called it peanut butter, because he thought people would just go ahead and swap one for one and not notice that everything they were eating tasted like peanuts. But either way, the magazine says this is, you know, a good item for those vegetarians who strenuously object to anything animal. So this is in an item in 1897. They're writing, and this may be Clubb writing. It's an unsigned item. But either way, the reader, the vegetarian reader, was expected to hear that and say, "Oh yeah, I know a couple of those." So we know that there were a lot of vegans around. They just didn't have anything to call themselves until 1944, when you know, Donna and Dorothy Watson and their pals over there in the UK coined the word vegan, started the Vegan Society, and started promoting the word. And within about a decade, it started permeating the United States on the East Coast among certainly vegetarians who were hearing this word and this concept and saying, is vegetarian enough, or should I go vegan? So there were two brothers who lived in South Jersey who decided the best way to settle this was to come to Philadelphia and tour a slaughterhouse, which apparently was a thing at the time you could do. And so they went and saw dairy cows being slaughtered, walked right to the killing floor. And when they got out of the slaughterhouse, one of the brothers, Jay, said right there and then on the sidewalk, I'm going to go vegan. I'm going to work until all the slaughterhouses are closed. He then went on to found the American Vegan Society in February of 1960. And it was just a few months later that Freya Dinshah, Freya Smith, came from England to marry Jay and become Freya Dinshah and become his partner in running the American Vegan Society. And for that reason, because there were several months in between his founding and her arriving in 1960, she refuses to call herself a co-founder of the American Vegan Society, but she really is the co-founder in our hearts, if you will. That's basically where I got to, and hopefully Freya next week will be able to talk more about her own experiences with that and the subsequent history of AVS. Did I make?
Well,
I went over time, didn't I?
oh no, that's no problem.
I
Thank you
was
so
really
much.
trying to pare it to the absolute essentials.
I know. I said what 23 minutes or something, and you. But
Yeah.
no, thanks very much for that. I got a couple of questions for you. One came in at 7:21. How do you spell his last name? Talk about the Anthony Benzet or
Benezet, yes, Benezet. And I know I didn't put name labels on these. I was just grabbing them and throwing them together for this. But I will be putting out a book, hopefully by the end of the year, that will have people's names written down in it, and people can enjoy this content via the
yeah,
written
and then
word.
people can search for them on the social media.
But he was I was talking with Quakers at the historical library in Swarthmore, and they call him Benezet, and it's very likely that he was known as Benezet at the time. He was a French immigrant. He was a Huguenot that fled persecution in France and came here. And knowing him, if Americans said, "Oh, so your name's Benezet," he probably would have said, "Yeah, sure, yeah, Benezet, fine, whatever." So, but his biographer Maurice Jackson calls him Benezet, and so I call him Benezet. It's his actual name.
Yeah, it's interesting how names are pretty flexible, aren't they? And they change over time and stuff. It's quite
Right.
as your own did, as I learned yesterday. So yeah, so there you go.
Well,
and Linda said, a great historical overview. This is so interesting. Love the images. And so you drew them yourself, Vance, right? And thanks so much for the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, as I think it touched on my biography, my whole foray into journalism started with cartooning. I started writing for City Paper, and I found that the pieces that I submitted that had a cartoon illustration attached tended to get accepted better. Eventually became political cartoonist for them and did a political cartoon every week for 12 years for them. So cartooning really informs just about everything about my life, and so it's hard for me to not make cartoons out of things. So maybe that's what I'm doing with veg history. I don't know. But
Jennifer says that's awesome. I'm an artist too, which is true. And so the style you've got, which is kind of like as it were a real picture in the background, and then is that the style that you normally use? Is it?
No, that was just for this project. These were originally done for most of them were originally done for a presentation I did in 2018 over at the Ethical Society called How Philly Went Vegan. And I wanted to have a certain look to them. I mean, usually I do draw my own backgrounds and do things like that. But for that, again, I wanted to get a bunch of things done quickly. And I said, this is going to be the look that I draw the person, and then I just grab from wherever. And so I have subsequently done a couple more that you saw that weren't originally done, but kind of did them in the same style.
Yeah.
So they're done, I guess, in the style of political cartoon style caricature. I do draw on other styles, but they're I mean trying to keep it coherent, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of people used to do caricature. They have an over large head, don't they? On purpose.
Well, there you go.
That kind of thing. So tell us about because when I was looking at the American Vegan Center website, which is separate from the American Vegan Society website, I'm not quite sure if there's a link.
Well, it's a subset of, yeah.
All right. Okay. I was quite surprised that they're pretty frequent, aren't they?
I'm sorry.
They're quite frequent. You're walking tours. So,
well, yeah, and we do them. I mean, we do offer them. People can schedule them. According to their schedule. We want to be able to, to help tourists who come to Philadelphia and just find out about them. But we do have a standard set schedule. Now we have just recently cut back from doing 2 tours every Saturday and Sunday to doing 1 tour. And I probably have not changed that on the American Vegan Center page. So that's a good reminder to do that. But right now, our regular tours that we offer are just Saturday and Sunday at noon, but we often do other tours, custom scheduled tours for groups or for other things at other times.
Yeah. And there's quite a lot of interest in such a thing.
Yeah, and well, I mean, it is interesting stuff. The thing is trying to get across to people how fascinating the content is. I mean, completely separate from my storytelling or my graphics, which I think are a good addition to it. The content itself is just so strong that really my main skill, if you will, is just trying to find out which things to leave out so that I can finish the tour on time. Because now I went into this researching thinking maybe there's enough here to create a walking tour out of. And then when I got to that point, I was like, great, all right. And that was, 4 years ago, but I haven't been able to stop myself from continuing to research. And so now I know enough to do 2 separate tours, of the same length. And so I constantly, even like as you saw today, really trying to pare that down to something I can deliver here. It's really just well, it's really like an Olympic type event of editing that I do, and I should get more credit for it, frankly.
Yeah, I'm sure you should, and it also keeps you fit, doesn't it? Which is pretty good. So, now, obviously, I've been immersed in the American Vegan Society and such for a while because I knew this was coming up, and also Freya's interview next week. So I've been doing quite a lot. Found out, for example, that the J.H. Dinshah stands for Hom.
H.J. Yeah.
Yeah. So
J is his middle name. Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I don't know because he was born in North America, but his family obviously from India, right?
Yeah, and again, his first name was Hom, so he went by J. I mean, it's easy to forget now that in the in the 40s and 50s when he was growing up, it was he was not considered a white person. He was a foreigner, even though he was born in America. And so he, even in the creation of the American Vegan Society, he was still doing everything he could to assimilate and to pass as just a regular guy and regular person, even though he had this obviously Indian last name. And yeah, he really had to, he was under a lot of stress, let's just say, but yeah, he did go by Jay.
Of course, yeah, as many people were. I was intrigued to find out that there is a YouTube channel as well, although it's not under the name of the. It's under the name of the book, I think. Is that right? Can you remember?
Powerful Vegan Messages?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Powerful Vegan Message. I think there's only about 44 people subscribing, so if people want to subscribe to that, it's quite interesting. There's lots of very short clips of J. Dinshah there, and it's pretty interesting. I mentioned before we came on the air that there's one where he does a lot of impersonations of different presidents and such like, which is quite unusual in a vegan presentation, which is pretty good. Cindy says fantastic presentation, so thank you, Vance, from me too.
Thank you.
And since Philly is an American historical center anyway, this is a brilliant idea, right? Okay, so
I mean, I just have to say I think that Philadelphia really is sleeping on this content that I've been trying to get across to my fellow tour guides and historical institutions, that it really is inspiring content that has to do with Philadelphia and has to do with ethics and social justice to a degree that is really an emerging concern of a lot of young people who, when you and I were growing up, you probably didn't hear as much about it as I, but Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and that crowd, they were like, oh, they were untouchable. And now people are like, yeah, they did this interesting thing politically, but they were also complete bastards as slave owners. And so we have kind of this counterpoint, this whole thing that is still happening in Philadelphia. And Anthony Benezet worked like hell to get the so-called founding fathers to include the eradication of slavery in their founding documents, and they gave them a lot of positive response, but then failed to do that. But there is this whole history that I think people could be really using and getting out there, and would help not just burnish Philadelphia's historical image, but actually attract more visitors to Philadelphia, since Philadelphia has lost so much of its manufacturing base, and now history-based tourism is such a large part of it. I really feel like that's something that it would be great if they. I mean, I know here I'm preaching to the choir, but I do go out and preach. I preach on the street corner.
Oh, right. Okay. On a little soapbox. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's interesting. In the end, I think some of the kind of leading, people in the States, as it were, started to make anti-slavery sentiments public whilst they still owned them. So essentially, I presume from our point of view, that was like a welfarist argument that they must have presented.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of. I mean, one of the things that distinguished people like Benjamin Lay and Anthony Benezet from a lot of people in the North was that there was a lot of antipathy towards slavery, but a lot of people were saying things like, yeah, they should make the slave owners let the people go sooner. They should make them not work as hard. They should have this and that kind of regulations to make it a nicer institution. And Benjamin Lay and then Benezet and his compatriots were like, no, there is no way to redeem it. It just has to go. It has to be abolished. But there was a lot of that continued into the 19th century, with people offering ideas like colonization, saying we should take the slaves out of where they are and move them to Africa. And again, Anthony Benezet entertained that topic and rejected it back before colonization was actually something that people talked about. He was like, in fact, he actually proposed reparations for enslaved people after freeing them as early as 1762. So there was a lot of that was coming out, and maybe, I don't know if there is an overlap between people who have this kind of ethical outlook towards animals that are looking at this other somewhat analogous situation with perhaps a bit more clarity than the average person at the time was. There's certainly a correlation there, whether or not it's a causal connection.
Yeah, and there's certainly a kind of echo of the abolitionist versus the reformist kind of thing. Now, right. I got a couple of questions about one of the founding kind of principles of the North American Vegan Society, which is ahimsa and dynamic harmlessness.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. So it was interesting because I was looking at the fact that apparently Gandhi, J. Dinshah said that when people started to use this phrase, it was seen as a negative, oh, we don't do this and we don't do that. And then Gandhi came along and said, yeah, but it's almost like, yeah, we're against that. But then, but we're pro justice, this kind of thing. And so, so Gandhi almost like was saying, it's a good concept, but it's something that needs to be campaigned for, right?
Yeah.
And so,
well, I mean, and again, ahimsa. I mean, more and more people now are hearing that word. When Americans especially first heard it, they're like, "What is it?" Well, it's harmlessness. It's non-harming, and they're like, "Oh, okay." So just sitting back in an easy chair, not doing anything. People like Gandhi and Jay, who idolized Gandhi, said we got to find a way to, get across to people that it's about proactively doing the most good and the least harm with every choice that you make. It's not about just trying to be hands off. It's about interacting with the world. And that's why he worked to popularize the phrase dynamic harmlessness. And
I think obviously the word dynamic in there is a crucial thing. It's interesting in the sense that the associated ideas about reverence for life, that was never taken up by the British Vegan Society, and I'm not quite sure why. I've not seen anybody write about it from the British thing. I wonder whether it's something to do with crop deaths and that idea about, well, what about plants? That in other words, it opens the door to that challenge. Whereas in North America, it was embraced much more.
Yeah. And again, I hate to keep bringing up Benz, but he did make several comments about how humans should be respectful, not just to other humans or even to other animals, but to the environment and to trees and everything else. And it really, from his standpoint, it was about our not having too inflated a notion of ourselves, which I think is really our humans having an inflated notion of ourselves is, inseparable from the what we call carnist ideology. It's that we have a right to just do whatever we want to, anything outside of the human sphere of being constrained by rights toward other humans. And it's kind of that just default assumption that you have to come up with a check on that to give animals this special category and say, well, no, animals should have these rights or whatever. Whereas, you can't just keep on doing that for everything. And people like Benz were looking at it in what I would call a more holistic perspective. And of course, in the 20th century, you had Albert Schweitzer talking about reverence for life. And he was a big fan of J. Dinshah's work and actually wrote him a kind of a fan letter about that, about specifically promoting the reverence for life concept. But I just have to mention, and I know I'm going beyond your question, but one of the most entertaining things in looking into all of the vegetarian philosophy and the vegetarian philosophers is Porphyry, who was Bronson Alcott. Bronson Alcott said Porphyry was his favorite author. And Porphyry wrote this very important 4-volume treatise on abstinence from the flesh of animals as food in 275 AD. And in that work, he has a section where he does frequently asked questions. Like, these are the questions that I get from people. Can you believe it? And he actually has, well, what about plants? Don't plants have feelings? And so he's rolling his eyes at this question back in 275 AD, that even right now, there is somebody on the planet who say, oh, I have the perfect gotcha for vegans. What about plants?
Well, I suppose they've got more of an excuse for asking it back then than now.
That's true. Yeah. Well, I mean, you didn't have the concept of sentience actually defined as well, although Porphyry did a lot of work toward that in that work. But yeah, certainly, there is a kind of a sliding scale if you want to talk about respect or reverence or whatever. You can say this may not be as sentient as that. I may not have as many moral obligations. But what we tend to do as humans is to just say, if I can come up with any excuse, then all of my moral obligations are out the window.
Yeah, it's
whereas vegans, I think, and they do tend to start the other direction and say, let's just like take a non-harming as the default and then decide when we actually have to do something. I mean, I ride a bicycle to work that has tires that have animal fat as one component in them. I don't refuse to come to work because that's, so I'm deciding that I'm going to, contribute to that much harm, even though it is something that I object to morally just because of the situation. And again, I think it really comes back to veganism being about being honest with that phrase, possible and practicable. You have to, nobody else can tell you what's practicable. It's up to you to practice it, but you have to actually be honest with yourself about what you can practice on a daily basis.
To be honest, Vance, I think you've proven with your bike that you're not a real vegan. But if now I don't know the answer to this one. I know that Donald Watson said that none of the pioneers of the British movement were religious in an orthodox way. But I've never seen any claims that Watson was a Quaker. I don't know whether you have, Vance.
Yeah, there's a lot of intertwining with religious concerns in America. I mean, and that was certainly something that has very much to do with American politics. I will say Angelina Grimke, by marrying Theodore Weld, disowned herself from the Quakers, so they were not religious in that sense after that wedding. But other people did definitely draw on religious arguments. I mean, you're familiar with Al Murray, the great atheist example. It's not like you have to have a religious basis when you go back in history and look at what was motivating people. But certainly in the U.S. in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a lot. It was almost impossible to extricate yourself from religious ideas.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so we're just past the hour. So just to finish off and to bring it back to the North American society, I was quite impressed.
Yeah.
Sorry?
American Vegan Society.
Yes, American Vegan. Yeah, and it's interesting. I always say North American, but
well, they created in '75 they created the North American Vegetarian Society because the World Vegetarian Congress had to have a vegetarian organization to host it. So that's where that came up.
That's just part of my sociological training. We talk about that North America is not America when you think about Central America and South, that kind of thing. So I was quite impressed that Jay Dinshah had this very kind of good grasp about the politics or the kind of theory about supply and demand. And he said that we've got to bring down the demand. And he used a really great line. He said, "We've got to bring down the demand for these goods," talking about products. And he said, "Well, actually, we should call them bads," which I thought was really good. But I'm going to just play 90 seconds from Jay, just to end with, and then a couple of points, and then we can be teed up really for next week. Then, so let me see if I can get this right. Here we go. It's silent at first, and it comes on.
They say that a man who is converted against his will remains unconverted still. Nobody can take you and shake a fist. I've given lectures on Gandhian pacifism and Satyagraha, the force of love power. And I said, it's absolutely impossible for me to come and shake my fist under your nose and say, listen, either you learn nonviolence or I'll break your nose. Can't make an impression that way. Certainly not a positive one. Might leave you with a cauliflower nose or bent beak or something, but it's not going to convert you to my way of thinking. We're not here to force anyone to our point of view. They tried that a few generations ago with prohibition. There was more liquor drunk, I understand, in the basement of the Congress in Washington, D.C. than there was before prohibition. You can't legislate morality or ethics. You can only tell people the truth as you see it. And if you have the light, eventually they'll come around to seeing the light.
Okay, so you can, there's the powerful vegan message. So that's on the website if people want to purchase it. It's still available as far as I know. I just wanted to comment about some of the themes there, Vance, in the sense that you can't convert somebody against their will, which is true, and that we're not here to force anyone, because even now, one of the main things you get on platforms like TikTok, oh, you vegans, you're always trying to force us to be vegan, and we're going, no, we can't do that. Plus the fact we want you to force yourself to be vegan by agreeing with the ethics of it. And then the bit that I really liked was when he said you can't legislate morality, because that is true. We've got to bring about cultural change, because if we change the law and people still don't agree with it, prohibition, people will resist it. And so that's what we found with the hunting bans in Europe, for example. They kind of get ignored or worked around. And so I thought that was pretty kind of good stuff. And that was the 1990s. So again, all these arguments carry on, don't they?
Yeah, I just want to say this, even though I'm supposed to be promoting Jay, I mean, I love to hear him speak, and he was a dynamic speaker. But it reminds me of something Dick Gregory said about a certain kind of goggle. I forget, he had a phrase that had goggles in it, and saying that going vegan is like you put on these goggles that now you've been looking at the world a certain way, but now you actually see what's going on, and you can't then take them off. And he said, and you also can't make anybody else put the goggles on. So, and that's the thing, is that we can't make people see things that they are not willing to see.
Well,
we can
you
only
could reverse
continue to
that
try
argument.
to put it in front of them.
You could reverse that argument sociologically, in the sense that society, through socialization, puts the speciesist goggles on, and you can't get it's hard to get people to take them off. So you could,
right. Well, that is, yeah.
So you could do it that way
Either
too.
way.
Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty good. You know, it's interesting. I mean, you probably, do you get that over there? Oh, you're trying to force us. It's a thing that's been said all the time.
I mean, not at the American Vegan Center. I mean, we do get people who come in who aren't vegan. Most of the people probably who come in aren't vegan, but they're interested.
You chain them to the wall, and they
don't
can't go unless they agree, right? So you chain them down. Yeah, I know.
Well, on social media, I mean, yeah, you certainly get people who say all number of wacky things, but that's par for the course. Yeah,
it is. So, it is. Well, yeah. Vance, I'd like to thank you incredibly much, if that's a phrase, for doing this. I'm very pleased that you were able to do that. I thought your presentation was brilliant, and it got a good response as well. And if people see the recording of this, do put your comments down below, and we'll respond to it. And if there's anything particularly needs an answer, I'll alert you to it, Vance. So maybe you could interact with the comments, you know, in the future weeks.
Great,
so people, so you don't have to go anywhere, Vance. I'll do the rest. And so I just want to say to everyone, thanks very much for tuning in as ever, and we'll see you soon on another Vegan Time Tunnel.